We're now in part 2. Theaetetus 201 to 210, Stephanus numbers. Don't forget part 2, fourth definition of knowledge. Knowledge is true belief plus logos. And we've got two things we're trying to handle in this little mini lecture. The dream theory of Socrates and the 3 attempts to explain what logos is. All right, so as I mentioned in a previous video, the dream theory of Socrates is on the same kind of pedagogical wavelength as Socrates' discussion of the Homo Mensura thesis, which led into the Heraclitean flux stuff and all that metaphysics and all the problems. This is kind of what Socrates is doing again here. So Socrates says, well, look, here's this, it's sort of a kind of a dream. Don't worry too much about the dream stuff. But the basic idea is that the world is made up of simples and complexes. What are the simples? The simples are pretty hard to articulate, but they would be like, ultimate particulars, like bare particulars, things that you just perceive. Complexes are, like everything that we're normally dealing with, like everything from a complex, like, looking at the board. It's a complex, it's got colors and shapes and all textures and all that stuff. Your experience is largely made up, pretty well, of complexes. You run around and as you experience things in the world, for instance, you call this a pen, or this is a cup, right? But that's a complex because it's made out of certain materials and has color and shape and all that. So all those more simple things like the shape is, shall we say, simpler than the cup itself. The color is simpler. The question is what's the simplest part of experience? Very difficult to get a hold of that. Philosophers have talked about that. That's a big part of the empiricist tradition. You find that the notion of articulating simples in experience in order to build them up, right? Like a tinker toy model, like, the big tinker toy, large-scale structures are everyday experience. What's ultimately underneath? What are the simples that immediately come in from the environment? Big style of doing philosophy in the empiricist tradition. Plato has Socrates talk a little bit about this. Well, knowledge in this metaphysics of the universe as ultimately composed of simples and our higher end experience composed of complexes, why don't we look at this ontology, this metaphysical picture, from the epistemological perspective, namely, how do we construct knowledge in this? So, if the world is composed of these simples and complexes, and again, what exactly they are is very difficult. So it is an abstract argument. So it takes a little while to follow it. But if the world were like this, what does knowledge equals true belief plus a logos look like? Well, so TB plus logos, this becomes something like this. In this world, in this metaphysics, in this ontology, this world of simples and complexes, when you talk about the knowledge of X, right, and X is just whatever, something, doesn't matter. Okay? We don't have to interpret it. We're keeping it at this abstract level. When you talk about knowing something, that's going to mean that you have a true belief about X, and you have, according to this theory, an analysis of X into X's simple components, right? So X is a complex, but it's made up of simples. That again is our metaphysical picture. The world is composed of simples, ultimately, and complexes are, again, shall we say, aggregations or collections or sets of simples. So knowledge of X is to be, where X is some kind of thing, and some kind of complex, is to be a true belief plus an analysis of X. So that's really what your logos is this analysis. And remember, to analyze means to break into its parts and to break it down as simple as you can, to get down to the simples. Again, we don't have to worry about what exactly they are. It's just think about the procedure, breaking it down to the simples. Okay, got it. Now, here's something to think about. If you hit a simple, say Q, so when you're breaking X down, right? So X is being broken down into all its simples. And I gave you the rough idea, like if X is a cup, its simples might be like shape, color, size, blah, blah, blah. So you start breaking it down, and let's say you have, R, S, these are the simples, and you find out, yeah, Q is in there. Okay, so it's a big long list, and if you hit a simple, say Q, do you know Q? Like, can you know simples? Well, if you did want to say that, you'd say knowledge of Q, and I'm just going back to here, knowledge of X was true belief about X into analysis of X into its simples. So knowledge of Q, just following the same logic, whatever Q is, we just are saying it's a simple. Well, it would have to be a true belief about Q plus an analysis of Q into its simple components. Wait a second, Q is a simple. So if Q is a simple, you can't analyze it anymore. That's what a simple is. It means it's unanalyzable. You can't say anything about it. You can't ascribe properties to it because it's a simple. It doesn't have properties. So what is it? Right? When you really start thinking about it, what is a simple? You can't really say anything about it. It's just like sometimes called like a bare particular. There's various ways in the philosophical tradition that people have talked about it. And some people have said, well, it's kind of like an immediately given. It's there. You can't say anything because the minute you say anything, you're attributing properties to it, and it's no longer simple. So simple is not simple, right? So keep that in mind. It's very difficult to talk about a simple. Right? Because the minute you start talking about stuff, you're piling on the properties. So, in other words, it seems that you really can't know a simple. You don't have knowledge of simples. If you did, then you would all of a sudden have to talk about them being broken down, and bang, you've got an infinite regress. Because you never hit a simple, because according to the very logic of your discussion, when you think you've got a simple and you analyze it, you've got more things inside of it. So it's like, I don't know, like maybe like a Russian doll thing where you think, I've got the smallest doll. That's my simple. Oh no, and you keep going. So you get an infinite regression. So if you stop it at, say, okay, there's the bare particulars, what do you get? Well, ultimately, knowledge really is of complexes. Simples are not known. They're just perceived, right? Okay, now aesthesis is creeping back in, and that's not going to be good news, right? But the critique of now Socrates says, okay, so what's the problem with this? Well, you can sort of get a feel for it. There's going to be kind of, oh, geez, knowledge is going to be built on things that aren't known. That's going to, but then again, if everything has to be known, you get an infinite regress. So you get into these, shall we say, philosophical tangles. Wittgenstein used to say it was like just mental cramps. Right, and you had to get rid of the cramps or let the fly out of the fly bottle. You had all kinds of great images of philosophical confusions. But all right, put that to the side. So the critique of the dream theory is Socrates says that you can't really know a complex without first knowing a simple. And he uses an example that I want you to think about with syllables and letters. Right, syllables are like complexes. Right. As a complex, and letters could be thought of as a simple. Can you really know a syllable without knowing the letters first? That's how we learn our syllables. We start by learning letters. But you can't know the simples, so that doesn't seem to work, right? You can't know a complex without first knowing a simple, but as we saw, you can't really know a simple. Well, maybe you just know a complex at one fell swoop. Right? Just bang, you just instantly come to know a complex. But that runs into trouble because knowledge of a complex, really has to include its simple components as well, a true belief and an analysis. So Socrates, on this level of my discussion, he's trying to find, and that any which way you turn this theory, you seem to get into difficult problems that seem to make it where you don't really have knowledge. That's the thrust of it. At the end of it, knowledge is not really possible. Now, to say knowledge is not really possible, fine, that is a philosophical position that has been articulated in various degrees in the history of philosophy, in the sub-tradition known as the skeptical tradition. that has to be treated with some care, though, because it's not global skepticism. But I'm not going to dig into all that. But the idea that perhaps knowledge is a kind of fiction has been seriously floated, but it has to be taken with certain parameters. But Socrates rejects that. He says, look, we started off the dialogue by presupposing that there is episteme, there is knowledge, and now we're being led to, again, like the Homo mensura thesis that we saw that led into the flux, and there's no meaning. Now we're led into a parallel kind of universe, shall we say, where there's no knowledge. You just lapse into skepticism. And this idea of trying to introduce simples seems to bottom out into a skepticism. This you find Aristotle will later pick this up and agree that largely you do bottom out into a kind of skepticism. Locke will struggle with this. We'll have a look at Locke on this. Hume will also struggle with the notion of these kinds of particulars. So this is shall we say, this is a story that comes out in Plato, and it's around for centuries. But the net sort of takeaway is that when you look at this discussion, this dream theory of simples and complexes and trying to unpack this, this leads you down to the idea that in the end, right, so in the end, knowledge, that in the end, knowledge is not possible. And Socrates says, no, that we're going to reject. All right, so that puts the shall we say, this dream theory, which is basically complexes and simples, to the side. But just one last note on that. I mentioned Wittgenstein in his discussion of philosophy as having mental cramps, and he thought that you didn't solve philosophical problems, you dissolved them. And he uses an old metaphor that is linked up with the medicine, that you just purge the body of these nasty kinds of philosophical mental cramps, right? As you use medication to get rid of cramps, you don't solve a cramp, you just get rid of it. Well, Wittgenstein does pick up on this simples and complexes in his early work called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which comes out in the early 20th century, and does in fact try to construct a picture of knowledge. There's no real epistemology, but he has an ontology of simples and complexes. And he does say that he did pick it up, one of the few times that Wittgenstein admitted being inspired by the tradition of philosophy. He liked to say he never read any philosophy in the tradition, which I think that's an overstatement. But he does admit that he was influenced by this discussion in the Theaetetus. And we've seen Wittgenstein come up before on the Theaetetus with regards to the first definition of knowledge, in terms of when Theaetetus has enumeration as an example, and Socrates rejects that. So, goodbye dream theory, thinking of rock music, dream theory of Socrates, on to the three attempts to explain what logos is. And there's a lot more going on than I'm talking about here, but again, I'm giving you the basics. So we're trying now three attempts to explain or to interpret what this term logos is. And Socrates makes fairly short shrift of each of them. He said, well, if it's a true belief, instead of the analysis into simple complexes, remember, it's true belief plus a logos. If we say that it's true belief plus speech about it, so knowledge of X is true belief about X plus speech about X, how helpful is that? Socrates says, this is too easy. If you have a true belief about X, you already have the ability to speak about it, right? If you already know something about it and you have a true belief, you can just expand on that. That's not really a logos in any more interesting sense about a speech about it. But is that really, anything more interesting for knowledge? You have a speech about it, you have knowledge. Is something deeper than just being able to talk about something. The main point for Socrates is to say knowledge is a true belief plus a logos, or knowledge is a true belief plus speech, really isn't saying much more than knowledge is true belief, and we've already rejected that as insufficient. So this, if you want a sort of a quick way of thinking about it, this adds nothing. This sounds good. Hey, but stuff can sound good and be basically meaningless. It's just redundant. So if you have a true belief, can you talk about it? Yeah, because you have a true belief about it. But does that really add anything deep to our understanding of what knowledge is? Socrates says, no, it adds nothing. It sounds good, but it really doesn't give us, there's nothing here. Okay, so goodbye logos as speech. What about logos? True belief of X, or knowledge of X, is true belief about X plus logos in the sense of enumeration of the parts of it. What about that? That sounds a little bit better than just simple speech, a little bit more precise. Maybe we're getting somewhere. Careful, we're treading into this kind of territory, right? We're talking about breaking something down, analyzing it. And we've got an enumeration of something's parts, of some X's, the parts of X. How does this help us? Knowledge of a wagon, to use as an example, right? Greek philosophers always use very simple things in their environment. A wagon, or a wagon wheel, or whatever, or a piece of pottery, we could use those. So, if you have knowledge of a wagon, it has, you have a true belief about it, and it's got wheels, axle, frame, rails, etc., boards, whatever. But what's this really going to do for us? Does this really help us? I can believe this. I can articulate all the parts. You can memorize, for instance. Let's say you memorized a bunch of parts in your car, or a bunch of parts in a laptop, or a bunch of parts in some kind of mechanism. And you had true beliefs about it. Yeah, I believe that, the car is over there, and I have true beliefs about all its parts. That is, I can list all of its parts. Now, that might be great, but if you said to your mechanic when you wheeled your car up, you say, what's wrong with the car? And the mechanic says, well, and then just listed all the parts of the car, you might say, well, okay, I can do that. I can go and list all the parts. What's wrong with the parts? Do you know what's going on in there? Do you really, you might even say, do you really understand cars, or you just got a laundry list of the parts of a car? Because, again, you could list all the parts of a car on a sheet of paper. Is that really knowledge? How does that help? So how is the enumeration of the parts of X really adding anything to the story here? It's not necessarily redundant, but it really, again, it's not adding anything. It's not helpful. So enumeration, well, this really isn't going to work either. Well, what about the third one? Okay, so goodbye speech, logos is speech. Goodbye logos as a tally or enumeration or a list. Hello logos as an account of X's unique aspect. Well, isn't that important in knowledge, that we're definitely aware of what we're talking about? Not necessarily. Bertrand Russell liked to say that in mathematics, the game is that we're not really sure what we're talking about and we don't really care. Well, how does that apply here, or does it? Well, Socrates says if knowledge is true belief plus a logos, knowledge is true belief plus logos, account of X's unique aspect. This is going to be, some true belief, let's say about Theaetetus. Theaetetus, you have a true belief about him, plus an account of what's unique to him, what makes him different. That sounds a little bit better than the other ones. And Socrates says, does this really say Theaetetus? Right? He doesn't think, again, or he thinks, again, this is not terribly helpful. It doesn't necessarily mean that you know him if you can uniquely identify. You can point out something unique about a person, right? We can do that. I could point out unique things about lots of people, and I could have true beliefs about those people, but that would be odd to say that, oh yeah, that means I know that person. So this notion of a unique aspect, again, it seems like it's too general. It seems like it's very specific. It seems like it's going to work, but again, it's too general, and it's, again, really adds nothing. It's not really helpful. These things don't work. Now, does this end the story? Think about this. We have 3 attempts to explain what logos is. Okay, this is 3, but are there others? So other possibilities for logos. That when I mean other by this is other possibilities of interpreting it. Could we interpret logos in different ways than these three? There's only three. Like you might say, well, what about a fourth one? There could be, or maybe there's 10. Maybe the problem is not the definition, true belief plus logos. Maybe the problem is you haven't got the right logos. It's true belief plus the right logos. These all failed. That doesn't mean, I don't know, the logos of tomorrow, some brighter person than us may come up with a really good logos for tomorrow. And we would say, yeah, you got it. That's the logos that we need to capture our notion of episteme. That's possible. Plato seriously doubts it, though. And that ties back to my earlier comment on Gettier in the 20th century when he tried to examine knowledge as justified true belief, the justified in kind of like the logos. And he said that that's not going to work. And people attacked his argument by saying you didn't get the right notion of justification. So off it went of people trying to come up with an account of justification, right? A special, right, logos, a special account of justification that would fulfill this and make this right-hand side of the equation equivalent to knowledge. And what did we get? We got this problem. People would say, yeah, we got a better example of a logos than these guys, but the minute someone had a logos that worked for some instances of what we would call knowledge, somebody would construct, as philosophers often do, a counterexample. And the same thing happens in science. Your theory applies to all this domain in nature, and then something new comes in, and your theory can't handle it. So you don't have a complete theory. Well, that's the same thing that happens in this discussion of the logos. Every time someone has come up with logos justification, that seems to work, somebody constructs another example and they amend it. So you get what you get are discussions where other possibility for logos, you'll get, yeah, logos like this, and they'll say, okay, well, maybe we'll call it logos prime. That will work. And then somebody says, nope, I have a counter example, and then they'll go, okay, logos amended, so double prime. Where you can see where this is going to go is that every time you get one that seems to work, somebody comes up with another one, and you keep getting this cycle. Is it a treadmill? Is it an infinite regression where, look, no matter how many times you think you got the right logos, someone's going to get you with another example? Or is there one way down the line that we could get? Is that possible? When would you know? When do you quit? When do you give up? When do you, as they say, fish or cut bait? How do you know these things? So this dialogue ends, and again, I'm giving you an orthodox interpretation of the ending, where it says, we just don't know how to define it. We have knowledge. We're not debating that, but we don't know how to define it. This whole exercise, right from the first knowledge as enumeration, to knowledge as this thesis, to knowledge as true belief, down to knowledge as true belief plus a logos, they've all failed. So it seems that we don't know what knowledge is yet. We know that we have it. How do we know that for sure? Well, the dialogue doesn't really answer these questions. Now, some scholars have interpreted this dialogue as, yes, there's a hidden answer as to what knowledge is here. That's beyond the scope of my lectures. Fascinating one, too. It is a different way to read the entire dialogue. But by and large, the consensus is within the context of this dialogue, the orthodox view is that this ultimately fails in its main quest, the articulation of episteme, or the answering of what is knowledge, but it succeeds by showing us a deeper philosophical point, namely that things that we have intuitively, right? And this is one of the often regarded as a key point. Something that you may believe intuitively, and you could be right about it, you can't really articulate in language. This is something that Plato does say in various places, that the really deep truths can only be encountered. They can't be expressed in discourse. Hence the model of knowledge, or the image of knowledge in the allegory of the cave, is that you only get true knowledge really upon a direct confrontation with it. You are obliged to, knowledge creates moral responsibility, you're obliged to go and help others out of the cave, but really at the end of the day, you can't really directly share what you've experienced because it's experiential, not capturable within, shall we say, a theoretical position. Namely, it can't be captured in philosophy. Philosophy ultimately points towards some sort of experiential contact with truth and knowledge. So that wraps up the lectures on the Theaetetus. It's going to end on this note. However, don't be too sad, because if you go on, I'm not going to do it in these videos, but if you go on and you read some of the other dialogues, Socrates picks this up the next day in another dialogue that he discusses a lot of these things and does seem to come to some sort of settled answer about knowledge. But for us here, we're going to leave this because this has been a huge influence on the philosophical tradition, which has pointed out numerous times of how difficult it is to find a definition, an articulation of this fundamental thing we call episteme, or knowledge. And that's it for the Theaetetus videos. Stay tuned for more on John Locke.